Hello, welcome to the channel Why Stories. Enjoy watching.
Forgetting the folder with the inheritance documents, the young woman returned to the hospital, but overhearing a conversation between two nurses about her fiancé. Finally, the weekend, said Senora Elisa, pouring herself some coffee. I just want to take a break from this uniform. It feels like a little more time in it, and I'll become one with it. Yeah, there's not much beauty in a white coat, agreed the second nurse, Denisa. But a wedding dress is another matter. Right, Sarah? Have you picked out your dress yet? Will you show us? Sarah smiled shyly. She was new at this hospital. Although she had already worked here for 6 months, she still hadn't gotten used to the fact that her colleagues always needed to know everything. Any little thing piqued their sincere curiosity. I haven't bought it yet. My friend and I are going to look for one today, but it's not customary to show it. Bad luck, you know. That's only for the groom, Denisa responded casually, but we're your friends. Superstitions don't work on us, confirmed Senora Elisa. We only wish you well. And all those superstitions are just nonsense. Look at me, I didn't even bother with a white dress when I married my Raoul. Times were different. I borrowed a nicer dress from a friend, and that was that. And we live like cats and dogs. He started drinking less than a year after the wedding, but I won't leave him. I love the fool. And you're worried about superstitions. Sarah felt an overwhelming urge to flee, to escape all these questions, and she yanked the zipper on her boot a bit too sharply. A fold got caught between the teeth, and Sarah barely restrained herself from cursing. She'd only made things worse and now had even more trouble to deal with. Where are you and Marco planning to celebrate? Denisa asked. Have you decided yet? Not yet, and it doesn't really matter. We might not even have a reception, just spend the money on our honeymoon. Marco has never been abroad, and neither have I. Maybe we'll find a last-minute deal. A honeymoon sounds nice, Denisa said dreamily. I can't even remember the last time my husband and I went anywhere. But I remember, grumbled Senora Elisa. Raoul and I go to the dacha every Sunday, by car if he's sober, but usually by bus. Sarah finally managed to zip up the troublesome boot, straightened up, forced a smile for her colleagues, and waved. All right, I'm off. Have a good weekend. See you on Monday. The nurses nodded warmly, and the door closed behind Sarah. She had no doubt that their conversation would soon turn back to her. After all, it's big news. She's getting married, and not just to anyone, but to a trauma surgeon from their medical center. And on top of that, she inherited an apartment and a house in the countryside from her aunt. It wasn't exactly a luxury estate, but according to Senora Elisa, she only had a dilapidated shed on her plot, barely more than a tool shed. Sarah's two-story house, modestly built in the 1980s, would probably seem like a real cottage to those two. Sarah went down the stairs, passing the janitor Amaris, who greeted her, smiled at a crying little girl, and handed her a toy that had fallen from her hands. Stepping out onto the hospital's porch, she was met with the dreadful November weather, rainy and gray. Sarah couldn't stand it. I wonder what it's like in Europe at this time. Maybe they're rushing into the wedding too quickly? They could wait until spring and go on a trip in April when everything is in bloom. And why is Marco so insistent about the wedding? Sarah opened her purse to retrieve her umbrella and frowned in confusion. Despite working as a pediatrician and being expected to be a meticulous person, her purse was a complete mess. She kept movie tickets from the films she and Marco had gone to, peppermint candies, scraps of paper, receipts faded to the point of being unreadable. If her colleagues peeked into her purse, they would definitely have another topic for gossip. Yet, despite the clutter, something was missing. It took Sarah just a few seconds of thought to realize that it was the folder with the inheritance documents she had collected. That was when Sarah truly lost her composure. She looked up at the sky and exclaimed with frustration, "What's going on?" She really didn't want to go back to the office. However, Sarah was absolutely sure she had left the documents on her desk. She had flipped through them, checking if she had collected everything on the list given by the notary. and then had been distracted by Marco's call, forgetting all about the papers. No wonder, his compliments could make her heart race and her cheeks flush with embarrassment and delight. Who cared about legal terms when you were being compared to a lily? Sarah walked back to the office, mentally preparing for the questions that might be asked, whether Marco had bought a suit and how much it cost, how many guests would attend the wedding. She was so tired of it all. As she got closer to the door, Sarah indeed heard her name. They were discussing her. Who would doubt it? And the conversation was at a high volume. Neither Senora Elisa nor Denisa knew how to speak quietly. Sarah easily made out every word and wasn't sure whether it was better to burst into the office and stop the gossip or to listen to what else they had come up with about her. "They're not going to have a reception, look at that," Senora Elisa said, jingling her cup. "They're saving money. With the inheritance Sarah got, she could eat with a spoonful of money. They'll probably sell the house. Young people these days aren't used to working the land. And they'll rent out the apartment, since Marco can live with them." Denisa didn't respond immediately, probably still drinking her coffee. Then she said, "Sarah might have plenty of money, but Marco? What about Marco?" "Marco doesn't have his own apartment. He lives with his mother and sister, and to be honest, his clothes aren't very luxurious. He might be good looking, but he doesn't have a penny to his name. Where does he spend the money?" Senora Elisa wondered. "I heard he takes on extra shifts and seems to be involved in a private clinic too. Who knows where?" Denisa replied philosophically. "Maybe he's saving it in a bank account. You know, the more digits there are, the warmer it makes him feel inside. Some people just stash everything away." Sarah listened to this and involuntarily clenched her fists. How dare they discuss Marco like that? Fine, she was used to being gossiped about and hardly paid any attention to it. But to drag Marco into the mud. However, the next words from Senora Elisa left her in shock. She forgot her anger, all her fury turned to astonishment. "Not surprising he's rushing into the wedding." Sarah said he proposed unexpectedly. "Timed it just right, you have to admit. Are you implying Marco is marrying Sarah for the inheritance?" Denisa asked with interest. What else could it be for? Maybe before, he was just dating her out of boredom. He's young, he needed someone to have fun with. But now he definitely wants money. Would he propose otherwise? Why not? Denisa asked. Maybe they're in love? Oh, love, sure, Senora Elisa scoffed. Look at them, where's Marco and where's Sarah? He's a movie star handsome guy. Half the nurses were running after him. And Sarah, a country girl with her braid, not much to look at. Skin and bones. Besides the money, she has nothing to offer, at least she caught his attention with that. Sarah forgot that just a minute ago she had wanted to burst into the office and tell Senora Elisa exactly what she thought of her and her loose tongue. The words left her mind, she felt as though she was in a vacuum. It was like middle school when a group of girls had taken a dislike to her and called her Big Nose. But that was different, she was small and shy, unable to stand up for herself. But now Sarah was an adult, a doctor who had seen a lot in life, including blood and corpses in the morgue, yet she still hadn't learned how to confront her tormentors. There was some rustling in the office, dishes clinking. Senora Elisa sighed heavily and said, I'll wash the cup and get to the injections. Medina in the ward asked for shots, I'll handle everything. Sarah recoiled from the door and ran towards the stairs. She didn't care about leaving quietly. The main thing was not to be seen by the gossipers. It was funny, just a few minutes ago, she was about to barge into the office and cause a scene, and now she was ashamed to look those two in the eye. Why? Sarah couldn't even understand herself. Maybe it was because she had finally realized that the gossip was very close to the truth, she wasn't much of a catch, and Marco, he was special. They had met by chance in a place that didn't exactly scream romance, but seemed to suggest that only bookish types would meet there, a bookstore. At least, a guy like Marco shouldn't have ended up there by definition, a tall, brown-eyed brunette with a bit of stubble on his chin and a slightly tired look. With a book in his hands, he resembled a mysterious romantic hero. Sarah stood a couple of meters away from him, idly flipping through a book, but she had long since forgotten what it was about or who the author was. All her attention was focused on the stranger. She couldn't say why, perhaps it was a sense of the beautiful speaking within her. Sarah loved everything beautiful, and this brunette had the right, almost perfect features, and she was meeting someone for the first time who resembled a fairy tale prince or... Sarah's gaze fell on a button hanging from the cuff of his shirt, hanging precariously. It was surprising that it hadn't fallen off yet. This was the only deviation from perfection and seemed odd, though it made the stranger seem more human. At least this small flaw made him look more like a mere mortal than a store mannequin. Sarah was so engrossed in the button that she didn't notice she had drawn the brunette's attention. It was unclear how long he had been standing like that, but when Sarah looked up at his face, she noticed that he was also looking at her. "Are you all right?" he asked. Sarah blushed and nodded. "Sorry, I was lost in thought." "And what complex equations were written on my arm that you were pondering for so long?" the man inquired, glancing at his sleeve. "Ah, now I see, the button. I can never seem to find the time to sew it on." "Sorry." "Why are you apologizing?" Sarah wondered. The stranger shrugged. "Well, I suppose I might have offended your aesthetic sensibilities." "What sensibilities?" Sarah asked again. She was very tired that day. She had worked at the hospital in the morning, then went on a round through the district, and now, after a long journey in bad weather, looked far from her best. It was March, her boots had long since soaked through, and, to be honest, they were covered in mud as if Sarah had been wading through a swamp. She had sneaked into the store, hoping the salespeople wouldn't notice. They indeed didn't notice. But Sarah had the misfortune of catching the eye of one of the most handsome men she had ever met. "Aesthetic," the stranger repeated, and casually tapped his foot. Sarah looked down. The man's shoes were not much cleaner than her boots. It seemed they had both trudged through the mud together. They exchanged glances and, without any agreement, burst into laughter. The man's laughter was so cheerful and infectious that Sarah couldn't help but join in, even though she knew that making noise in such a place was forbidden. "Please, keep it down," the cashier asked from the register. However, the request was made without much annoyance. It seemed the charm of the customer had worked on her too. Sarah even felt a sudden pang of jealousy, though it was extremely foolish. How could she feel jealous of someone she was meeting for the first time? It was absurd. A little later, reflecting on that moment, Sarah told herself that she had simply felt an immediate connection with Marco. As if, despite his handsome appearance and her own plain one, she knew he was her other half. The man waved to the saleswoman and said, Yes, of course, excuse us," and then whispered to Sarah, "We are cut from the same cloth, don't you think?" "In this case, it seems so," the girl agreed. "But not in all." "What do you mean?" The man gave a meaningful look at the book she was holding and tapped his finger on the cover. "Our tastes in literature are a bit different." Sarah finally remembered that she had been reading something before meeting this person in the store. The book was written by a famous dietitian and was about weight loss. "You don't need this," the stranger declared authoritatively. "Throw the book away and don't you dare pick it up. If you go on a diet, you'll get anorexia, I'm telling you. Your figure is perfect as it is." "Thank you," Sarah replied, wondering to herself if this could be considered a compliment as he spoke in such a professional tone. "It's not for me, it's for a friend. She's been hunting for this book for a long time but hasn't been able to find it. I happened to come across it." The man nodded, as if accepting her explanation. Sarah couldn't help but ask, "Are you a dietitian then?" "Me? Good heavens, no. I don't even want to delve into that field. That's something for women." "But you're a doctor?" Sarah pressed. She didn't even know why this thought crossed her mind. Maybe it's true what they say, birds of a feather flock together. "A traumatologist." I treat broken limbs. And various other small things. Like the spine, Sarah snorted. Just trifles, nothing to mention. So what are you looking to buy here? Probably some incredibly obscure book that the average person wouldn't understand a word of? Without asking, Sarah took the book from his hands and opened it with astonishment. The average person really wouldn't understand, confirmed the stranger. You can't read this, Sarah protested. Admit that you're buying the book for someone else. Why can't I? This is my favorite author. Every evening, I opened the latest novel from his pen and read it from cover to cover. Actually, the book that Sarah took from him wasn't a novel but Japanese comics. It was one of those volumes with a cover featuring smiling girls and boys with colorful hair, and inside there were far more pictures than text. Such books were usually read by schoolchildren, not by a respectable person like a traumatologist in dirty boots. All right, I give up, the stranger said with a smile, taking the comics back from her. My sister, like your friend, has a birthday coming up, and I was picking out a gift for her. I wanted to check out the plot, and, embarrassingly enough, got really into it. I suppose now isn't the best time to mention that I sometimes read gory detective stories when no one is looking, Sarah said, and they both shook with laughter. I told you we are cut from the same cloth, the man said, extending his hand. I'm Marco. And you? Sarah, the girl replied. Marco's phone in his pocket rang insistently. He glanced at his watch and shook his head with concern. Time to get to work. You set an alarm even during the day? Sarah asked. It wasn't that it was so important, she just didn't know what to talk about to keep him around for at least another second. Unfortunately, yes. You see, this job has given me an unpleasant trait. I can sit somewhere and fall asleep in any, even the most inconvenient place. I understand, Sarah murmured, growing increasingly gloomy. Marco smiled, waving the book at her. I'll take this, read it at my leisure, and give it to my sister. The key is not to put such things on my desk, otherwise, my patients might not trust me with their limbs. Good luck with your friend. And good luck with your sister, Sarah replied. She watched as Marco paid for the book and left the store. As he was opening the door, he turned around, as if feeling her gaze, and waved at Sarah. She waved back. Through the rain's haze, she saw Marco walk to his car and drive away. Sarah's mood matched the weather, just as gray and cheerless. It seemed that with Marco's departure, everything around became dimmer, as if he had taken the sun with him. And he didn't ask for your phone number? How rude, her friend Rika exclaimed when Sarah recounted the whole story. He wasn't obligated to. Maybe he didn't like me? Then why even bother getting acquainted, giving your name? So you just remember him before bed along with all the saints? Tormenting yourself because he's not with you? Rika was fuming. Rika, what are you talking about? It was just politeness. He wasn't even obliged to give his name. It probably just slipped out. The friends were sitting at Sarah's place, watching some silly TV show with a plot that seemed suited only for teenage girls. Much like the comic Marco had flipped through in the store. Sarah wanted something light to avoid adding to her mental load with the problems of TV characters. Avoiding mental load wasn't working. Sarah found herself thinking about Marco no matter what she was doing. She even dreamed about him once, buying flounder together with Marco in the fish section. What does it mean to dream about fish? Sarah asked her friend somewhat disjointedly. Rika gave her a sidelong glance. Do you want me to interpret it according to Freud or a normal dream book? If it's Freud, you need a man, my friend. And I even know which one, Rika added with a meaningful pause. You should have gotten his number yourself. Me? Sarah was surprised. But that's inappropriate. It was inappropriate in the 19th century. Now a girl has to take matters into her own hands if she wants to be happy, Rika said instructively. So we're going to act. Or rather, you are. And how do you propose I do that? Sarah asked cautiously. Rika was an extravagant girl with a vivid imagination, so any kind of unexpected idea could be expected from her. You'll go to the trauma department and find him there. Yes, and offer him my hand and heart, Sarah said with a smirk. Rika, you're always in your element. Rika shook her head. No hand, no heart. You'll accidentally run into him, just strolling down the corridor. Accidentally? What possible reason would I, a pediatrician, have to go to the trauma department? I don't have any business there. Well, now you will. You'll go there to check on a patient. Do you have any favorite little ones among your kids? Sarah didn't really have favorites. She cared for all her children equally. However, Rika, who was already beginning to draft a plan, was not to be stopped. I work at the reception desk. You're in luck. There's someone there you can talk to. I'll find out who's recently come in with a fracture, and you can see if you know them. After that, it's a matter of technique. You'll wear a shorter skirt, a more revealing blouse, and strut down the corridors. Sarah laughed. Rika, this is a hospital, not a dating venue. Besides, I don't wear anything like that, you know that. That's exactly why he didn't ask for your number. You need to dress the part. Oh, in November? I don't even have a car to dress up for. Fine, let's give it a try. Though I have a feeling nothing good will come of your plan. Are you agreeing then? Rika asked, delighted. Great. Then wait for the patient list on your desk tomorrow. Sarah and her friend had long forgotten about the TV series dramas. More serious events were brewing in Sarah's life. Sarah, are you going for coffee? Senora Elisa asked, heading for the office door. No, thank you. I'm too busy, Sarah replied absently, glancing at the list her friend had sent her. Rika was surprisingly efficient, something even a private detective would envy. It was quite possible that she had caused more than one scandal with clinic visitors that day. Rika was busy with everything but her direct duties. Senora Elisa gave Rika a suspicious look, like a hound sensing something amiss, but said nothing and went off to drink her coffee. Meanwhile, Rika sent another message. I found a wardrobe for you in the catalog. Check it out, order today, it'll arrive tomorrow, and by Friday, Barreto will be at your feet. Rika had even managed to find Marco's last name and all his personal details. Not surprising, since Marco was the only trauma doctor in the department and was well known because half the female staff had a crush on him. It was very unpleasant for Sarah to realize that she was just one among many and had no better chance of success than the pretty girls in the procedure room. The wardrobe Rika sent was quite something, full of rhinestones and glitter. The outfit barely covered the body and was more suited for the beach than a hospital. It was clear that Rika was trying to amuse her friend, and she succeeded. Sarah laughed and texted Rika, "Thanks for the effort, Sherlock Holmes. I'll manage from here." The reply came almost immediately, "You're welcome. I'm waiting for new gossip from you. We're meeting at the cafe in the evening, unless you're leaving the hospital with Marco." Sarah shook her head and started to study the list. Most of the names were unfamiliar. But on the 10th name, something stirred in her memory. Tonio. I think he came with his grandmother once. Sarah found his details on the computer and nodded. Indeed, Tonio Martir, 4 years old, had come a month ago with a cold. She couldn't say exactly why she remembered this boy. Perhaps, unlike most of her young patients, he had been unusually quiet. He sat on a little chair, clutching a chipped plastic toy soldier, and looked at Sarah with open, trusting eyes, as if he couldn't believe she would do anything bad. And she remembered his grandmother, a frail elderly woman with a swollen face and a sickly blush on her cheeks. Sarah had been more concerned about the grandmother than Tonio himself. The boy's cold had been relatively mild and caused no particular alarm. "Do you have high blood pressure, by any chance?" Sarah asked softly as she took Tonio's temperature. "Does your head hurt?" The woman shrugged nonchalantly, as if it didn't really matter. "It does hurt. Who knows why?" Maybe it's blood pressure, maybe magnetic storms. Every newspaper is talking about those. Or maybe it's just a pile of problems, big and small. I don't know. Sarah couldn't solve other people's problems. Her field was medicine. So she asked, "Well, do you at least measure your blood pressure?" "I measure it sometimes." "What good does it do?" "I see the numbers, and then what?" Sarah wrote a prescription for Tonio and, unable to help herself, kissed the boy on the forehead. "Get well soon. And take care of your grandmother. You see, she can't manage without you." Tonio's grandmother seemed less than pleased with the advice and tugged the boy away. "He'll help, sure. If only he'd sit quietly, that would be help enough. I'm worn out, chasing after him," she muttered as she disappeared through the door. Tonio waved goodbye to Sarah and slipped out after his grandmother. Sarah watched them go, feeling an odd sense of helplessness, as if their problems had become her own. Senora Elisa asked, "Why the long face? What do you mean? You look like you swallowed a lemon without washing it down. Why so sour?" "I feel sorry for them. It's clear this family has problems, and I can't do anything to help." Senora Elisa scoffed dismissively. "Problems? They should have drunk less." "What, does Tonio's grandmother drink?" Sarah asked, surprised. "She doesn't seem like an alcoholic." "The grandmother might not drink, but her daughter, Tamara, drank like there was no tomorrow. Got herself pregnant and dumped the kid on the grandmother to raise while she drowned herself in booze. Now both the grandmother and the grandson are suffering. And I'll tell you this, Tamara should have been raised better, and she wouldn't have these problems now. So don't waste your sympathy on her, she doesn't deserve it." Sarah didn't understand this philosophy. Was Tonio to blame for his mother's love of alcohol? She thought again of Tonio's trusting eyes and shook her head, trying to clear away the troubling thoughts. In some ways, Senora Elisa was right. There was nothing she could do, so it was pointless to torment herself. But now, seeing Tonio's details on the monitor, Sarah felt a pang of guilt. She had truly forgotten about the boy and wouldn't have remembered if it hadn't been for that ridiculous plan to meet Marco. Decision made, Sarah told herself. I'll go to the trauma unit, but not to flirt with Marco. This is nonsense. I'm not cut out for beauty contests and vying for the first stranger I meet. I'll leave that to adventurers like Rika, it's not for me. Even though Sarah reassured herself with these thoughts, she felt uneasy as she headed to the trauma unit. She wasn't sure if she wanted to see Marco again or not. On one hand, she probably did. After all, she had dreamt about him and held his hand tenderly in a fish market. On the other hand, she was afraid of meeting him again. Within the hospital walls and without a book in hand, she couldn't imagine what to talk about with her new acquaintance. Everything that came to mind seemed silly and inappropriate for the moment. Perhaps discussing the weather would be a safe topic if they met. It always seemed relevant. Sarah had only been to the trauma unit once, when she needed to find Senora Elisa, who seemed to work in half of the medical complex and knew all the patients by heart. From that one visit, she remembered little, only that she encountered patients with various degrees of plaster casts in the corridors. Now, as she walked through the corridor, it felt like the end of the world had happened outside the hospital. So many people couldn't possibly be injured all at once. In her pediatric ward, everything seemed more peaceful. She rarely faced issues more serious than colds and coughs. When she did, it was usually the work of other specialists, surgeons or, for example, ENT doctors. She hadn't seen the harsher realities, and now, witnessing all these injured people, she felt a kind of shock. On the second floor, where the children were, she felt both better and worse. Better because it was her domain, the children's voices behind the doors, the simplicity and directness. Worse because the patients she was about to meet were children. Sarah's heart ached at the thought of encountering children in casts, including the injured Tonio. Perhaps she had signed up for this in vain? Finding the right room, Sarah stood for a moment, gathering her courage, then opened the door, or rather, slightly ajar it, cautiously, fearing that Tonio might be asleep and any noise could wake him. Her guess was correct. The boy was indeed asleep. Sarah entered the room, closed the door behind her. The second bed was empty, and she sat down on it, listening to Tonio's quiet breathing. He looked so pale, she thought, and small, as if he had become even smaller since our last meeting. What happened? Sarah sat and looked at Tonio, unsure of what to do. In her hands, she held a small bag of toys, a set of African animals she had bought for Tonio the previous evening. Stories from Senora Elisa and the old toy soldier Tonio had brought to his appointment led her to believe that the boy likely didn't live in luxury, so extra toys wouldn't hurt. But how to give them to Tonio? Should she leave them on the nightstand and leave, or wait for him to wake up? Her doubts were resolved by chance. The door to the room opened, and a familiar voice said, "What a surprise! I didn't expect to see you here." Sarah jumped and turned around. She had completely forgotten about the second purpose of her visit, meeting Marco, and now found herself flustered by his unexpected appearance. "Hello," she whispered, standing up. "Tonio is asleep. Let's talk in the hallway." Marco nodded. Sarah placed a bag of toys on the nightstand and, giving a final glance at Tonio, stepped out the door. "How do you know his name? Are you acquainted?" Marco asked. "Not really. I'm a pediatrician from the ward he's assigned to," Sarah replied. "I hope my white coat serves as proof of that." "Not really," Marco said seriously. "You could be a pediatrician from any other ward, or a general practitioner, or, I don't know, a chemical analyst from a factory." Sarah looked at him, puzzled. Marco smiled. "Just kidding, of course. I do believe you. But still, why did you come? Are you so concerned about Tonio?" "Yes, I found out by chance that he was hurt, but I didn't get the details." "What happened to him?" "Concussion," Marco said more seriously. "There's no real danger, but I'm still worried about him. I can't quite understand why. We have plenty of patients. It seems this little guy has a talent for making people care about him." "Probably," Sarah smiled. "I liked him too from our first meeting. Has Tonio's grandmother been visiting? Maybe they need some help? If so, let me know." Marco shook his head. "No help needed. And to be honest, she doesn't look like the type who would accept help from anyone, even though she clearly needs it." "Did you notice her swelling?" "Yes. And when I tried to talk to her about it, she seemed angry with me. I know Senora Linda well. It was the same with me." Sarah looked at him in surprise, not knowing what to say. The same? So Marco had also promised help to this family? If so, his behavior was starkly different from the image she and Rika had formed, a playboy from the clinic, a local Adonis only thinking about girls. Sarah didn't know what else to say. She still had no plan for the conversation, and mentioning the weather seemed at least a bit foolish. "Thank you for taking care of Tonio," she said hesitantly. "I won't keep you any longer. I should probably go." Sarah expected Marco to politely say goodbye and for them to part ways, but he unexpectedly said, "Would you like to meet up this evening?" "What?" Sarah asked, surprised. "Meet up? Why?" "I could tell you all about every vertebra in detail, their characteristics, and their effects," Marco said thoughtfully. "Or I could invite you to the park. They're promising a lovely rain this evening, something we haven't had in a while. But I have a better option, a theater." "You're inviting me to a play?" Sarah clarified. "Or do you want to show me the architecture, give a lecture on Baroque style?" It seemed she had managed to surprise Marco because he laughed. "Well, we are definitely cut from the same cloth, as we decided back in the store." Sarah nodded. "Yes, indeed. But tell me seriously, are you really asking me out on a date? Or is this some kind of game? Because, sorry, but I don't have the desire or time for games. That's not really my style." Deep down, Sarah expected Marco to try to end the conversation, that his invitation was indeed just a joke, and there was nothing more to expect. However, he said, "Not a joke. So, how about today at 7? I'll come pick you up, wherever you say." "Let's meet at the theater's entrance," Sarah said evasively. She was afraid that her mother might accidentally see what was happening from the window and start having some expectations about a potential son-in-law. Sarah didn't want her mother to imagine all sorts of things about Marco. And now, a year later, she wondered if she had been the one to imagine things, if she had created fantasies of her own. "Do you think it's true?" she asked when she told Rika about everything. "Is Marco with me because of money? Does he really not need me?" Rika waved her hands in protest. "Honestly, I don't recognize you, friend. Since when did you start listening to gossip from old women about you? And even believing everything they chat about?" Sarah shrugged. "I don't know, maybe I believed it because there was something convincing in that chatter. You surprise me. For example, the old ladies by the entrance gossip about me having 2 men on the side, one apparently for weekdays and another for special occasions. And that, judging by my outfits, I don't work in a hospital but in an adult store. And is that all true? No. But Rika, look at it yourself, a lot of it seems to add up." "Like what, for example?" her friend asked tiredly. "That one of these 2 men is my brother, who comes over to help with repairs. And the other is Tavio, whom I broke up with 2 years ago, but he still has hopes. No, I mean about Marco. Take our first date at the theater, for example. He didn't buy the tickets that day, he came in through the back entrance, and some sort of ladyguard came out and let us in. She kept thanking Marco for helping her son with his treatment and then asked the ticket seller to give us seats. What was I supposed to think about that situation? That you got yourself a resourceful guy who can get benefits from everything and has a bunch of useful contacts," Rika replied. She didn't seem impressed by this argument. Sarah continued counting off on her fingers. "And how does Marco dress?" "No, of course, clothes aren't the most important thing for me. But it's strange." "What exactly?" "You managed to land Marco Barreto, whom all the girls in our medical center sigh over, and you're still dissatisfied. I bet most of them wouldn't bat an eye if he asked them out, even if he showed up in a t-shirt and shorts. But Senora Elisa was right, he works almost every day, we hardly have time to go out, and he dresses like he buys his clothes from a thrift store. It looks decent enough, but somehow worn and shabby. Have you asked him where he puts his money?" Sarah shook her head. "Are you kidding?" "No, of course not, it feels a bit awkward." "Maybe he's preparing some wedding gift for you," Rika suggested, "or a trip. Have you decided where you're going?" Sarah shook her head sadly. "No, maybe nowhere. I would really like to go to the sea, but what's there to do at this time of year? And Marco doesn't want to go abroad yet, he says we need to get on our feet first. Maybe he's just a tightwad?" Rika suggested. "I don't even know," Sarah sighed. "Sometimes it seems like Marco gives me the same flowers he gets from grateful patients. Why buy something new when he can just regift what he already has? Well, I can only give you one piece of advice, talk to Marco and ask him directly about everything." Sarah nodded. "I'll try." One thing she didn't mention to Rika, not even in a conversation with her best friend, was that she had concerns beyond Marco's possible mercenary nature. Lately, Sarah had begun to suspect that Marco might be cheating on her. In reality, Sarah wasn't particularly concerned with Marco's fashion sense. At first, she didn't pay much attention to it at all. If he had dressed in high-end designer clothes, she might have felt out of place in her plain, unremarkable sweaters. As it was, they were, as Marco liked to say, cut from the same cloth, though he was handsome and she was merely average. Sarah never considered herself beautiful and wasn't particularly bothered by it. But after meeting Marco, something strange happened. It seemed that when he was around, she became more beautiful, as if his radiance extended to her. Sarah wasn't sure if this was true, but the photos of her with Marco had become her favorites. Their first date at the theater was simply wonderful. Sarah couldn't recall the exact plot of the play. For the first 15 minutes, when the lights went out, she sat tense as a spring, waiting for something she didn't even know. Marco's presence was so palpable that Sarah felt she could almost hear his breathing, and the closeness of it sent an electric tingle through her body. "Look," Marco whispered. His breath tickled Sarah's ear, making her flinch, and asked cautiously, "Where?" "Over there, in the corner of the stage, under the tablecloth." "Do you see it?" Sarah looked closely. At first glance, the large table covered with a white tablecloth seemed harmless, and she couldn't figure out what she was supposed to be looking at. Then she noticed the tablecloth moving oddly. There was no draft in the room. So why was it moving? "A dog," Sarah whispered in surprise. Nearby patrons shushed her, but Sarah paid them no mind. A small, orange Pomeranian emerged from under the table, sniffing around purposefully before running to the main character. "I bet this guy will say now that the dog was brought by his friend," Marco whispered. Sarah didn't have a chance to respond, as at that moment the actor playing the lead role said, "Richard, why did you bring that dog? You know perfectly well I'm allergic to dog hair." The second act also had some improvisation, but the young couple had stopped listening, silently shaking with laughter and trying not to burst out. That was Marco all over, finding humor in everything, even in things that others would have overlooked. After the performance, they stepped outside, where it was still drizzling, and looked at each other. "Can I give you a ride home?" Marco asked with a comically raised eyebrow. "Or do you still think I'm a maniac?" "You can, of course," Sarah blurted out without thinking and then blushed. "I mean, you may." Marco nodded. "Good. Then the second question, can I call you by your first name?" Sarah thanked the darkness that had fallen over the city, as it made her cheeks burn even hotter. "Of course." Sarah didn't quite understand what they had become that evening, friends or something a little more. But something intangible had changed. The next day, Sarah went back to the trauma unit to check on Tonio. She and Marco had exchanged phone numbers when they parted, but he hadn't called, and it felt awkward to be the first to call. So, Sarah resorted to the same plan as before. This time she walked down the corridor with more confidence, not fearing a meeting with Marco, but rather looking forward to it. Sarah opened the door to the room and frowned in confusion. Tonio was asleep again. Then she looked at the clock and smacked her forehead. "How silly of me. It's nap time." Sarah's surprise grew even more when she realized who was sleeping in the adjacent bed. There, instead of a small boy the same age as Tonio, on the narrow hospital bed, curled up with his knees to his chest, was the trauma star Marco Barreto, sleeping soundly. Sarah stared at the scene with amazement for a few moments before entering the room and quietly closing the door behind her. Not knowing what to do next, she just stood there, watching Marco. He looked younger in his sleep, but without his usual smile, he appeared tired and sad. And that little wrinkle on his brow. It was unclear what Marco was dreaming about, but it was clear that his dreams were not joyful. Should she wake him up or leave before he woke and caught her eavesdropping? Sarah didn't manage to come to a decision in time. Marco stretched, hit his hand on the back of the bed, hissed in pain, and opened his eyes. "Sarah?" he asked, surprised to see her. Marco's face instantly took on a carefree expression, as if he had either become himself in an instant or, on the contrary, put on a mask to hide his true emotions. "What are you doing here?" Sarah asked. "Although, sorry, that's a silly question. I mean, why are you not going home and sleeping here?" "I need to go to the clinic for my second job in an hour." It seemed unwise to waste time and drive across the city. The boy from this room was discharged yesterday, and a new one hasn't been admitted yet. So I thought I wouldn't disturb Tonio if I temporarily took this spot. "You don't fit this room," Sarah said. "Why not? Am I too tall for a 5-year-old? You don't have any casts or bandages." "A fake patient, clearly," Sarah said, and immediately realized that jokes clearly weren't her strong suit, as even she didn't find it funny. Well, if a security guard sees me here, he'll definitely break something, Marco smirked. By the way, nap time is almost over. You woke me up just in time. It would have been just my luck to get caught here. Sarah thought that Marco's fans were probably aware of what was going on but were covering for their idol to avoid any trouble for him. Such surprising solidarity among women, considering the serious competition between them. Tonio rubbed his eyes with his fists and sat up. Seeing the adults, he looked embarrassed. "Hello," he whispered shyly. "Hello, Tonio," Marco nodded. "Meet Sarah, the girl who brought you your zoo." Only then did Sarah notice that near the boy's pillow, on his bedside table, and even on the floor were the plastic animals she had given him: lions, monkeys, crocodiles. "Sarah, thank you," the boy said, pulling the blanket over his head, apparently feeling shy. "The animals are very beautiful." "You remember me?" Sarah asked in surprise. Tonio nodded, the blanket swaying from side to side. Not knowing what to talk about, Sarah asked the first thing that came to her mind. "And how is your grandmother? Is she visiting you?" "Tonio's grandmother will come soon," Marco answered before the boy could even open his mouth. "Right, Tonio?" The boy nodded again. "She went away for a while, but she'll be back soon," he said from under the blanket. Sarah raised her eyebrows and looked questioningly at Marco. He gestured towards the door and stood up. "All right, Tonio. We're going to leave now, but we'll definitely come back tomorrow. They'll bring you a snack soon, and there will be strawberry juice, your favorite. Eat, rest, and regain your strength. See you tomorrow." Tonio stuck out only one hand from under the blanket and waved it. Marco closed the door to the room, and his smile vanished. His face became as gray and gloomy as it was when he was asleep. "Why did I get involved in this?" he muttered. "What did you get involved in?" Sarah asked, and seeing that Marco was slow to respond, she clarified, "Something happened to Ivan's grandmother, didn't it?" "What happened to her?" "She finally took your advice and went to the hospital," Marco sighed. "Actually, she was taken there by ambulance." "She really pushed herself too hard," Sarah whispered. "Or maybe Tonio's hospitalization was the last straw for her. With her blood pressure, these kinds of stresses. And now you're deliberately keeping Tonio here because he has no one to go back to?" Sarah guessed. Marco nodded. "Yes, I'm quite the criminal. Can you believe it?" Sarah was silent. Marco added, as if to clarify his words. "Actually, Tonio has already recovered. He's out of danger." But Senora Linda asked, "If anyone finds out what I'm doing, there could be problems." Sarah couldn't hold back and, disregarding the rules of politeness she'd learned from her mother, threw her arms around his neck. "You're amazing, Marco. You're doing everything right." He hesitated, seemingly stunned by her action, but still hugged Sarah back. This time, she didn't feel the awkwardness from his closeness that she had felt at the theater. And that felt right, too. Sarah finally realized that she had found her person. She was sure of it. Gradually, these visits to Tonio became a tradition for Sarah. He stayed in trauma care for another week, and every day she would come, bringing him sweets and toys. Marco would also join them, except when he had to rush off to another job. "We're like a little family," Sarah thought, marveling at these bold thoughts of hers, as it probably was quite bold of her to have her eyes on Marco. One day Sarah arrived at the ward and saw that Tonio's bed was empty, the sheets had been removed, and only the mattress remained. Sarah immediately understood what this meant and felt a brief shock. Tonio had been discharged. She knew this moment would come sooner or later, but she was completely unprepared for it. "How will I manage without Tonio?" she wondered. "And without Marco? Now I have no reason to visit here." Sarah couldn't figure out which departure saddened her more. "He's gone home," a voice said from behind her. Sarah turned around and looked at Marco. He looked as tired as ever, but now also sad. It seemed that Tonio's discharge had upset him too. Has Senora Linda recovered? Yes, she was discharged this morning. I wouldn't say the woman looked much better than during her last visit here, but at least she was discharged from the hospital too. Sarah was silent, not knowing what to say. She felt an emptiness inside her, much like the room after Tonio's departure. Well, I'm glad. She sighed. It's a pity we didn't get to say goodbye, but it's for the best. Anyway, I'll head out now. I still have my rounds to make today. Maybe we'll see each other in the evening? Marco asked unexpectedly. Sarah didn't have a chance to respond. Her phone rang, and she glanced at the screen before waving to Marco. It's my mom. I have to go. Okay? We'll talk later. Sarah never got around to fulfilling her promise. She got caught up visiting patients' homes, and then, at her mother's request, stopped by a store. She was so wrapped up in her tasks that she only remembered Marco's call in the evening, when calling or texting was already inappropriate. The realization brought Sarah down. Clumsy, she chided herself. Fool. That was your chance to get closer, and you missed it. She slept poorly that night, tossing and turning and cursing herself for her absent-mindedness. It seemed she was putting others' needs ahead of her own. She got caught up in helping patients while she needed help herself. For the first time, Sarah realized she would miss Marco, those hospital visits, and playing with Tonio. She arrived at work pale and irritated. For the first time, she scolded Senora Elisa for leaving papers scattered on her desk. Senora Elisa, can't we keep the office tidy? You might as well leave dirty coffee cups lying around. It's unacceptable. The nurse looked at her with displeasure and surprise, but didn't argue, although, given her grumpy nature, she could have. Senora Elisa just made a lot of noise picking up the papers, slamming drawers, and generally getting on Sarah's nerves. The workday went on as usual. Sarah saw patients, listened to them, and even answered parents' questions, but her mind was elsewhere. She kept thinking about Marco and wondering what he was doing at any given moment. More than that, she wondered what he thought of her. He's probably angry with me, she thought bitterly. And no wonder, I practically blew him off, as Rika would say. Will he even want to talk to me after this? Well, get well soon, she said warmly as she bade farewell to her latest patient, a little girl with pigtails. And don't be afraid, no more shots, just vitamins. The girl and her mother left, and immediately a new knock sounded. Come in, Senora Elisa shouted, then muttered under her breath, Here they come, coming, there's no end to it, it's supposed to be lunch break now. The door opened. Sarah's heart skipped a beat, that bright, white smile was unmistakable. Good afternoon. May I come in? Marco asked with a boyish tone. What do you want? Senora Elisa asked, clearly annoyed. She was on familiar terms with everyone in the hospital and spoke to them informally. You've outgrown our department. If you need a medical certificate, go somewhere else. Marco was undeterred by her response. You're as sweet as ever, Senora Elisa, he said, but I'm not here for you, I'm here for Sarah. For Sarah? Elisa repeated, shifting her surprised gaze from Marco to her colleague and back, evidently struggling to understand what the two might have in common. Marco ignored her question. So, Senora Sarah? He asked. Could you step outside for a moment? Sarah, avoiding eye contact with the nurse, stepped into the corridor. Hi, she said quietly. I'm sorry I didn't call yesterday, I got caught up with patients. No problem, he replied cheerfully. I was busy too, so we wouldn't have been able to meet anyway. But what about today? Today? Yes, the weather is terrible today, rain mixed with snow, going to a cafe seems a bit uninspired. I'm inviting you to the aquarium. The aquarium? Sarah asked, surprised. Yes, didn't you know about it? It just opened on the next street. Do you want to go? It's great there. The offer was unexpected but, undeniably, more original than sitting in a cafe or restaurant and very tempting. Inside Sarah, even though she was a serious professional, there was still a child who was thrilled by Marco's idea. "Of course, I want to," she said. "Have you been there already?" Marco blushed. "Me? No, I haven't. Why would I? I've just heard about it from people." "Well then, how about 6 o'clock, after my rounds? Let's meet at the aquarium. Or should I pick you up?" Marco asked. Sarah nodded decisively. "You can come pick me up." She described each of her dates with Marco in detail in a journal she had kept since her youth. Now, rereading it, she tried to understand, when did things start to go wrong? "Things were off from the beginning," Rika said, observing her, "because there was a third party in your relationship." "You think Marco was cheating on me?" Sarah asked, referring to her work. "Yup, with work. You yourself told me that sometimes you went an entire week without a date because Marco was so overloaded with work at our hospital and his fancy clinic for the wealthy." "He was. But he was just trying to earn more money." "And did you ever ask him what he needed it for?" Sarah shook her head. At the start of their relationship, she had interpreted Marco's workaholism as a character trait. There are people who want to save the world, take on both their own and others' responsibilities, and work like crazy. Given Marco's kindness, he could have been one of them. But then again, Marco also seemed upset about not being able to meet. Or was it an act? "So ask him," Rika said. "You're getting married soon. Have a serious conversation and ask him, 'Rich kid, why do you need so much money?' What if it's a surprise? Maybe he wants to give a wedding gift? Well, if that's the case, he should give it now or at least hint at what it's going to be, because his surprises have left you with dark circles under your eyes and looking like a drowned rat. He earns, and you're losing sleep over worry." Sarah sighed. "I can't stop thinking about Senora Elisa's words that Marco is with me just for the money." Rika was silent. Sarah looked at her pleadingly and asked, "What if it's really true? And here we are, spending time picking out wedding dresses." "Well, if it is true, I'll tear Marco's head off," Rika muttered. "I've spent so much on a bridesmaid's dress." "But seriously, do you remember how he reacted when he found out you were inheriting money?" Sarah tried to recall that moment. At the time, she was in a flurry not from grief. She had hardly communicated with Aunt Rosa, who left her the inheritance. In fact, Aunt Rosa had shown little desire to maintain contact with Sarah and her mother, the widow of Aunt Rosa's late brother. She was reclusive since her youth, Sarah's mother had said. "Your father used to say that Rosa had no real friends in school or college. She was a careerist, a perpetual honor student, always wanting to be the best, and people don't like that. As far as I know, she never had any romantic relationships. There was some unhappy love in Rosa's life, but it ended badly. The guy married someone else, and Rosa shut herself off from everyone. She even came to our wedding for just a couple of minutes, handed over a gift, and then left right away. We hardly ever talked." If her mother had said that, what could be said about Sarah? Her only encounter with Aunt Rosa had been in early childhood when Rosa had attended her christening. Her father had invited her, hoping to maintain some familial connection with his sister, but his efforts were in vain. Nothing beyond the church visit materialized. "She held you in her arms for the entire service, then kissed you on the forehead and left," her mother recounted. Sarah never saw her aunt again and had no idea how she lived. Thus, after Rosa's death, it was a great surprise to Sarah to learn that the entire inheritance was left to her. "Why did she do that, Mom?" Sarah asked her mother, searching for some explanation. "I was nothing to her." Her mother shrugged. "Nothing? You're her niece. I, on the other hand, am a stranger. Rosa never liked me, and you were the only child she had, so to speak. Who else would she leave everything to, if not you?" Sarah was bewildered and didn't know what to make of it all. She was overwhelmed by conflicting feelings: gratitude for the aunt who took care of her even after death, pity for the old woman, confusion about why Aunt Rosa had never wanted to communicate with her while alive, and shame for not shedding a single tear over Rosa's death, considering she had been a stranger to her. Unable to keep these feelings to herself, Sarah decided to share her turmoil with her beloved. The cafe, with its pastel colors and floral decor, seemed ill-suited for a conversation about death, but Sarah couldn't help herself. "My aunt passed away," she announced, leafing through the menu with little interest. She had no appetite. Sarah didn't understand why she had come. "I'm sorry for your loss," Marco said. "Was she elderly? Heart issues?" "You asked like a real doctor," Sarah sighed. "Yes, Aunt Rosa had vascular problems. It's not so important what she died from, what matters is that Aunt Rosa hardly communicated with me during her lifetime." Marco shrugged. "That happens, and often. It was her choice. What's troubling you now? That you didn't make any effort to reach out? And that too. My conscience is tormenting me for not having communicated with her, for not showing the slightest interest in Aunt Rosa's life. And now she leaves me an inheritance. Others would be on cloud nine, but I'm worried. I must be just a fool. Am I? Of course not. You're just a very kind and conscientious person. Wait a minute. What inheritance?" The previously listless and apathetic Marco, who seemed to be falling asleep from exhaustion over the menu, looked at Sarah with a glimmer of. The girl couldn't quite tell what it was: surprise, interest, greed. "An apartment and a country house. It seems like too much for me." "Well, your aunt had a clearer view, didn't she? And I can't imagine anyone more deserving than you. It's better than if all the property went to some villain." "Maybe, but it's strange. If Aunt Rosa loved me so much, why didn't she want to communicate?" Marco shrugged again. He seemed so tired that he didn't even want to talk. The waitress arrived at their table, and the conversation came to an abrupt halt. Sarah forgot about it and wouldn't have remembered if it hadn't been for the gossip she heard at the hospital and the question Rika asked. How did Marco react? Rika repeated. "I don't know what he was thinking, but he definitely wasn't indifferent. He seemed interested." "And how long after that did he propose to you?" Rika continued the interrogation. "A week, I think." The friends exchanged glances. Sarah felt a cold, hopeless feeling settling in her soul, as if she had been plunged headfirst under ice. "A week," Rika repeated thoughtfully. "And he hadn't mentioned anything about marriage before that?" Sarah nodded. "Well, there you have it. Does he want to be with you for you, or because of the money? I don't even know what to think anymore." Sarah didn't know either, but she had no intention of marrying someone she wasn't 100% sure about. "So what will you do about the wedding?" Rika asked. "Will you dive in head first and marry Marco, come what may, or will you cancel everything? Should I return the dress to the store or keep it?" "Keep it, Rika. It suits you very well. As for the banquet, we won't cancel anything. If we don't celebrate, we'll drown our sorrows in drinks. We've been preparing for this day for so long. You have such beautiful hair. I'm telling you the truth, smooth and shiny. I've worked with many people, but I've never seen such beauty in my life. You're such a lucky one." The hairdresser chatted on without stopping, clearly as nervous as the bride, because her fingers trembled slightly. Sarah knew perfectly well that the hairdresser's entire speech was a lie from start to finish. Her hair was perfectly ordinary, even though it was waist-length. The hairdresser didn't have many clients. She was Rika's relative's daughter, talented but just out of college. And Sarah certainly didn't feel like a lucky person, mainly because she was surrounded by liars. Rika caught her friend's gaze in the mirror, read her emotions, and firmly said, "Julia, stop chatting. You won't finish anything at this rate. Don't forget, you still have to work on my hair, which isn't as great as Sarah's, so you'll have your hands full." Julia blushed and nodded rapidly. Yes, of course. "Oh, sorry, I think I left the invisibility cloak in the car. I'll go get it." Julia ran off. Rika sighed and said, "Sorry about her. I should have called a proper specialist, not this mishap. It's just that everyone praised her so much." "It's okay," Sarah replied. "It doesn't matter right now." Rika looked at her carefully. "Are you nervous?" Sarah nodded. "Yes, it's almost like before an exam. I'd forgotten what this feeling was like." "Well, today it's Marco who will be tested, not you, so there doesn't seem to be much to worry about," Rika said with a smirk, then immediately grew serious. "Sorry, that was a silly joke. We're all on edge today." Sarah forced herself to smile. "Don't worry so much, Rika. Whatever happens, everything will be fine. The truth will come out, after all." "Well, if Marco..." "Then everything will return to normal," Sarah interrupted her friend. "I'll just live the way I did before, forget that I ever had a fiancé, and become like one of Jane Austen's heroines, spending evenings with a book in my new apartment, and it'll be doubly pleasant at the country house during vacations." Her voice trembled on the last words. Rika shook her head disapprovingly. "Don't pretend everything is okay, not even with me. As if I don't see that you want to burn both the books and all the inheritance you got from your aunt." "Maybe I do want to," Sarah said sadly. "Without him, I was just an ordinary girl and knew that if a guy liked me, it was for no particular reason, just for who I was as a person." "Or for your looks," Rika added. Sarah waved her hand wearily. "What looks? And you too. You're very pretty, you just don't see it. You believe those cranky nurses who never say a kind word about anyone, but you don't trust me, your best friend. I'd rather Marco like me for my looks than for my money." The out-of-breath hairdresser returned, and the conversation had to be cut short. Sarah looked at herself in the mirror and didn't like what she saw. It wasn't about the poor job of the stylist or her own face, which seemed plain to Sarah. It was the unhappy expression frozen deep in her eyes. She looked like someone going to their execution, not a happy bride. "I wonder if Marco's relatives will even come?" Sarah thought. The only relative of his she knew was his mother, whom she had met only once. The meeting had been somewhat awkward. Marco hadn't invited Sarah to his home. They met at a cafe and spent half an hour in tense silence, glancing at their watches. Only Marco spoke, trying awkward jokes to lighten the mood. His mother was grim, tired, barely said a few words, and seemed uninterested in the wedding talk, as if her son's affairs were none of her concern. Sarah had greeted her quietly and then remained silent, unsure how to approach the meeting. Maybe she simply didn't make a good impression on Marco's mother at first sight? Instant dislike, such things do happen in life. "There are strange people," Rika had said then. "Don't worry about it, there are plenty of eyeballs in life." "But this is my future mother-in-law," Sarah had protested. "I would like us to have a good relationship, not like in the jokes where the mother-in-law wants to get rid of the bride." "Well, from what you've told me, it seems you won't have much of a relationship with this woman. She seems just as unsociable as your Aunt Rosa. But maybe it's for the best. Believe me, it's much better than having a mother-in-law who sticks her nose into all your business." Sarah had never met Marco's sister, for whom he bought comics, although she wanted to. "This weekend won't work. Nina is going out of town with her friends," Marco said when Sarah suggested going somewhere together. "Or too much studying at school. Sorry, but Mom won't let her go out." Sarah found all of this strange and puzzled over what was happening, but Rika came to her rescue. "It's nothing special, just an ordinary, moody teenager," she said. "Most likely, the girl is jealous of her brother and is turning her nose up at you. Don't worry about it. Sooner or later she'll get used to the idea that Marco is an adult and makes his own decisions about his life." "I hope so." Sarah didn't fully believe that, and now, on the eve of the wedding, she was starting to feel a shiver at the thought of meeting these strange people and having to talk to them. Although, maybe there won't be a wedding at all, the girl comforted herself. Why worry for nothing? The comfort was not very effective. The thought that Marco might be a scoundrel made things even worse. He arrived on time, as promised, exactly at 10 in his old car, which could have used a wash. The hood was covered with dirty splashes. Additionally, Marco was so eager to escape the rain that he stepped right into the center of a huge puddle that had formed in front of the steps. The friends watched him from the window. Rika commented on the scene with a thoughtful look. "No, I understand that you're trying to save money and all, but this is a bit much. Not only does your fiancé not have a limousine, but now his shoes will be dirty too." "Just like during our first meeting," Sarah replied. "Maybe it's a sign. What if today we're seeing each other for the last time?" "All right, don't panic prematurely. Maybe your guy is the real prince." Sarah's confidence was dwindling, but she forced herself to smile. "I'll go meet him." Rika stopped her. "No need, I'll handle it. Since when does a bride run out to greet the groom at the first call?" Rika marched off to the foyer with an air of business, and after a moment, her chirpy voice, friendly enough not to arouse suspicion but still cool, could be heard. Then Marco appeared in the room. "Hi," was all he managed to say before falling silent, staring at Sarah with wide eyes. The girl could understand why. With the makeup Rika had done, she looked like a beauty. Her skin seemed to glow, her lashes were long and fluffy. If only it weren't for that hunted expression on her face. "You don't look like yourself today," Marco said after a brief pause. "Do I look beautiful?" "No, you've always been beautiful, just different, and, to be honest, a bit sad." Sad was an understatement, as Sarah felt like crying from everything that was happening, but she shook her head. No, it's fine, or rather, almost fine. But it seems silly to get upset over money on a day like today, so." "Over money?" Marco asked, puzzled. "What happened?" Sarah watched him closely, trying to read every thought, every emotion. "Remember I told you I got an inheritance?" "Yes, of course, I remember, from the aunt you never talked to." "And what's wrong with it?" "The inheritance is fine, just not for me. There are other heirs who are closer than I am." A look of confusion crossed Marco's face. "How is that?" "As far as I understood, the aunt left all her property to you." "There were some issues with the will," Sarah replied evasively, "some legal complications. I don't understand it well, but it seems it was drafted incorrectly." "What kind of stupid lawyer did you get?" Marco exclaimed. "Don't get upset yet, we'll find another one." "I wonder who is more upset." Sarah thought. "Me or you?" Marco, indeed, didn't look very pleased, though he might have been like that since he arrived. Sarah couldn't figure it out. Marco rubbed his forehead with a worried look, as if he had a headache, and nodded toward the door. "Well, let's go then. We might end up being late for the ceremony." "Where's your mom?" "She'll come straight from the hairdresser. She should be calling a taxi." "We can go now." Marco nodded, took another step, and as if he remembered something. "You're my bride, so let me carry you out of the building, as is proper." Sarah shook her head and smiled nervously. "No, don't. We might both fall into the puddle. And besides, I think the bride is carried out of the church, or am I mistaken?" "Well, maybe." "Okay, you're right. The last thing I need is to injure myself on our wedding day. Let's hurry up. I'll have plenty of time to carry you in my arms. Our whole life is ahead of us." Rika was waiting for them in the foyer, wearing a coat over her elegant dress, and was completely ready to go. She looked questioningly at her friend, as if asking, "Well, how did the experiment turn out?" But Sarah just shrugged. She herself hadn't understood much. It seemed that Marco was upset by her announcement about losing the inheritance, but it didn't change his plans for the wedding. Looking at Marco's trim and fit figure in his steel gray suit, which matched the color of his eyes, Sarah couldn't believe that this man would soon be her husband. Was she happy? Yes, Sarah did truly love Marco, but that love had been poisoned by an accidentally overheard gossip, and Sarah still couldn't say for sure what or who she believed in. They left the building and hurried through the drizzling rain to the car. Marco opened the door for Sarah, helped her into the seat, and then hurried to the driver's side. "Are we going to be late?" Rika asked as she settled into the back seat. "We'll try to make it on time," Marco replied. "Still, you arrived later than you promised. Were you not in a hurry for the wedding, or did something happen?" Sarah was embarrassed by her friend's bluntness. "Rika, don't start. We'll be fine," Marco sighed. "I promise." They drove in silence for a while. Marco focused on the road, while Sarah watched him. Recently, Marco had grown even paler and thinner, as if he were sick. This worried Sarah. She also felt uneasy because she clearly sensed that Marco was hiding something. Taking advantage of the car stopping at a traffic light, Sarah touched her fiancé's elbow and quietly asked, "Is everything okay with you?" "With me?" "More than okay," Marco answered with exaggerated cheerfulness. However, his smile when he said this looked unnatural and forced, and Sarah didn't believe him. He's lying, she realized. She wanted to ask Marco to let her out of the car, to say that the wedding was off, but Sarah didn't have the courage to do so. And so they arrived at the church in silence. Sarah's mother and a few of her friends were there, as well as Marco's friends, a small group of guests, just the closest ones, although. "Your mother and sister didn't come?" Sarah asked. "They couldn't make it," Marco answered briefly, but his face seemed to freeze. "Got it," Sarah thought, "they don't want to know me. I wonder what I did to upset his family." Seeing the couple, the guests rushed up with their greetings. The congratulatory words, which Sarah felt were premature, blended into a continuous, indistinct noise. Finally, "Darling, I thought you were going to be late." Sarah's mother adjusted a strand of Sarah's hair that the hairstylist had carefully styled and nodded. "You look so beautiful." "And what did I tell you?" Rika whispered. "Everyone thinks that way." Sarah wasn't listening to her friend. Her attention was focused on Marco, who, with a pale semblance of a smile, was responding to his friend's jokes and didn't look like a newlywed at all. Then his phone rang, and Marco stepped aside to take the call. Sarah and her friend watched him. "What's going on?" Rika asked. "Is it normal to behave like that at your own wedding? You should be going in now. Maybe it's something important? What could be more important than the wedding? Is he getting another call from the clinic? Are there no other orthopedic surgeons in town? Is Marco the only one in the world?" Sarah didn't get a chance to answer. Marco finished his call and walked back to them. If he had seemed pale before, now Sarah realized she was mistaken. He was now deathly pale, and his gaze was slightly off. "I need to run," he declared without preamble. "Run? Marco, where to?" "I'll explain everything later." "I'm sorry." He lightly touched her cheek with his lips, barely making contact, and walked away. For a few moments, Sarah stood stunned, then she rushed after him. "Marco! Wait!" Sarah didn't get far. Rika grabbed her by the arm. "Where are you going?" She smirked. "Away from us poor folks. You don't have the inheritance anymore, right? So why would he want a bride like you?" "No inheritance?" Sarah's mother perked up. "What are you talking about? What happened?" If anyone was truly troubled by this false news, a fabrication of the two friends, it was her. Marco looked back, but instead of focusing on Rika, he glanced at his abandoned fiancée, gave her a brief nod, and then slipped out the door. In the foyer, a commotion started. It seemed that not only Sarah's friends and acquaintances, but also complete strangers were discussing the incident. "So what are we going to do?" Rika asked. "Are we just going to let him go?" Sarah nodded sadly. "Let him go? I'm going home too." "Home? But you said we would go to the cafe and drink away our sorrows." "I don't want anything, not to drink, not to scold him, not to celebrate. I want to go home," Sarah said, sounding just like a child. She wished she could cling to her mother's skirt and hide behind it from all the sorrows of the world, just like when she was a child. Unfortunately, that was no longer possible. She now had to deal with her problems on her own. "Well, maybe we could go to the movies?" I hear a new comedy has been released. Sarah shook her head. I don't want to. I already have enough humor in my life. Then let's just go for a walk, Rika persisted. In this weather? The friends, without discussing it, looked out the window. A torrential downpour was raging outside. In such weather, wicked stepmothers are known to drive their stepdaughters out of the house. Somewhere behind that curtain of rain was Marco. I wonder how he's spending his vacation. Sarah wondered. Or rather, our wedding vacation that we were supposed to spend together. In a few days, she was going back to work, and Sarah could hardly imagine how it would all be. Senora Elisa and Denisa had probably already gossiped about her and would now look at her. How? With malicious glee? With pity? Both were repugnant. And Sarah was even more afraid of running into Marco at the hospital. Has he not written to you? Rika asked. Sarah shook her head. No. Don't you want to call him and find out what's going on? Why did he treat you so badly? Why? It's all clear. He wanted a rich bride, but instead, he got a pediatrician from a clinic. Such a disappointment. Sarah said this and felt tears streaming down her cheeks. Marco had been, one could say, her first love, but he had trampled on that feeling, walked over it with muddy boots. I don't want to see him anymore, Sarah said. And I don't want to hear any explanations either. Well, maybe you won't have to, Rika tried to comfort her. The orthopedic department is on the other side of the medical complex. You won't have many chances to run into him. And yet Rika was wrong. Sarah met her would-be fiancé very soon, on the very first day she returned to work. It felt like déjà vu. Around noon, someone knocked on the office door. Senora Elisa muttered under her breath. Don't they look at the time? They came right at lunch. Then she said more loudly, Come in. Marco entered the office. This time, he was without his usual smile, looking somewhat embarrassed and disheveled. Senora Elisa choked on her prepared phrase and glanced at Sarah. Not with the sympathy she had shown all morning, but with a questioning look. Should she send him away or not? Sarah, hello. Can we talk? Marco asked hesitantly, as if he really feared being turned away. About what? Sarah inquired. Her heart was pounding fast. The presence of the nurse was very distracting. Sarah didn't know how to act with Senora Elisa present. On the other hand, if the woman weren't here, she probably would have broken down and cried alone. Alone, Marco added, glancing pointedly at Senora Elisa. She nearly exploded with indignation. Who do you think you are, you wretch? You left the girl at the altar and now you're giving orders about who should be where. Please don't yell, Senora Elisa, Sarah intervened. I'll handle this myself. We do need to talk. Let's go. They stepped into the hallway and moved to a quieter spot by the window. Marco asked, Well, are you really going to yell at me? Go ahead, I won't take offense. I won't. I don't have the time or the energy for that. Just tell me what you wanted and let's be done with it. We haven't even started yet, Marco said with a weak attempt at humor, and it's my fault. I came to explain what happened and to ask for your forgiveness. Sarah crossed her arms over her chest and nodded. Well, make it quick, if you please. It's because of my sister. What? Sarah was surprised. What does your sister have to do with this? Wait, I think I understand. She never wanted to meet me, avoided contact, didn't even come to the wedding. That phone call. Your sister hated me and gave you some kind of ultimatum, forcing you to leave the wedding? Marco smiled sadly. I wish it were that simple. The truth is, Nina is ill. What's wrong? My sister has cancer, which is why she rarely leaves the house. She feels self-conscious and unattractive after treatment. That's why she didn't want to meet you. She saw how beautiful you are in the photos. She's not opposed to the wedding. In fact, she wishes us happiness, but... So why did you leave? Because on that day, Nina had a flare-up. Our mother called, all panicked and hysterical. I couldn't leave them, you understand? Sarah nodded, stunned by this revelation. Now I understand why both you and your mother looked so exhausted. Is that why you work so much? For your sister? Marco nodded. Yes. Nina could be treated abroad, but it costs a fortune. I believe I can raise the necessary amount. The only problem is time is against me. Sarah interrupted him. I'll help you. How? I'll sell the country house we inherited from my aunt. I don't need it anyway. I'm no countrywoman. The inheritance? You said it was no longer available. I lied to you, Sarah admitted, blushing. Rika and I thought you were with me because of the money, and we decided to check if that was true. Marco smiled sadly. Because of the money? Do I look like a starving man? I'm sorry, Sarah whispered. If only I had known about your sister. It's me who should apologize. You shouldn't have had to lie. Nina just wanted me to keep everything a secret. Will she get better? Sarah asked. Well, her condition has stabilized for now. I think. I believe everything will be fine. Of course it will, Sarah assured him, because now we'll be together, if you still want that. I think that question should have been asked by me, Marco smiled. They embraced, ignoring the curious glances from some of those in the hallway. Sarah felt warm and comfortable in his arms. She only now realized how much she had missed this. Then Sarah cleared her throat and pulled away. Well, I should probably go now. It's not right for us to be watched like this. Wait, Marco caught her by the hand. There's one more thing I need to tell you. I'm not sure how you'll react. What's the thing? Sarah asked, alarmed. Marco's voice was so serious that Sarah's mind raced with possibilities. Maybe he wanted to tell her he didn't love her? Senora Linda had a heart attack the other day. Tonio's grandmother? How do you know? After I allowed Tonio to stay in the hospital while she was receiving treatment, Senora Linda developed trust in me, which seemed impossible given her character. I kept in touch with them, so when Senora Linda stopped answering calls, I decided to find out what was happening. And what happened to her? Sarah asked, though she suspected from Marco's expression what the answer would be. She passed away. Sarah sniffled, feeling more sorrow for her fiancé than for the woman she barely knew. What will happen to Tonio now? She whispered. Will they send him to an orphanage? He doesn't seem to have any other relatives. He does, Marco corrected her, or rather, he will. I've decided to take him in. Of course, it will be challenging, especially with my mother and Nina to care for as well, but... Not alone, Sarah objected. We've already talked about this, together. She hugged Marco again, wishing that this moment could last forever. Sarah now fully understood what kind of person her fiancé was, and no other proof of his honesty was needed. Did we remember to buy tomatoes? Sarah's mother asked anxiously as the car entered the village. We didn't forget, Mom, and cucumbers too, and a whole bunch of jars with various purees for Enzo. We got everything. Yes, confirmed the little blonde girl, who, despite being in a child's seat, was held by her grandmother's hand. Sarah looked at her daughter with affection. She was already 2 years old, but Sarah still couldn't get enough of her. Probably because Maria looked so much like her husband. Although Marco always claimed their daughter was a mini Sarah. That was probably the only question that sparked heated debates between the couple. We're such good country folk, bringing tomatoes from the city, Marco remarked, watching the road to avoid running over a chicken. It's all right, I'll retire and move here, her mother reassured him. I'm tired of your city. You'll come visit me on weekends. Right, Tonio? The boy sitting next to her nodded seriously and added. And we'll get a dog. I don't need a dog right now, Marco noted. We already have 2 cats in the house. So Maria is fine, but I want a shepherd dog. Marco looked at Sarah and smiled. The more people in the house, the better, right? She nodded. Of course. I think we've all known that for a while. Because of the trip to the store, they arrived at their own home last. Marco's mother, his sister, and Nina's boyfriend, a serious guy in glasses studying to be a programmer, were already there. Near the fence, Sarah noticed Rika's car. So, she and her husband, Alvar, had arrived too. Where have you been? Nina called out, waving at them. If you'd been any later, we'd have eaten everything ourselves. There might not be anything left for you. Marco pulled huge grocery bags from the trunk and assumed a wounded look. Ungrateful. Just look at how much we brought. Sarah watched the scene unfold and smiled, and the beautiful, healthy-looking Nina, it was hard to recognize the pale, skinny girl Sarah had met during their introduction. And the house, which had endured so much, years of neglect, transfer of ownership, a bank mortgage and buyback, and then the clumsy repairs Marco and she had done themselves. After everything that had happened, this little estate had become even more precious to her. And hadn't she changed too? Sarah thought. It all started with a simple trip to the bookstore, she reflected. Who would have known where that would lead me in the end? Everyone gathered around the table, and Rika, who had managed to hug everyone present, was the first to raise a toast. Today we are here to celebrate the anniversary of Marco and Sarah's wedding, she said. I remember it as if it were yesterday. Do you remember, Marco, how you managed to get your shoes dirty even in dry summer weather before the wedding? Stepped on someone's fallen ice cream. That's the most vivid thing you remember? Marco smirked. Or maybe you want to recall how someone overindulged in champagne and tried to show us Latin dances to waltz music. No more, Rika interrupted him. Such details are not for the ears of descendants. We're raising toasts with compote instead of alcohol for the children, so keep it appropriate. They spent a long time at the table, laughing. Later, Maria wanted to play hide and seek. Everyone joined in. Somehow, Marco and Sarah ended up hiding together. They climbed up a ladder to the barn roof, where even the ever-present Rika wouldn't think to look for them. If we lie down, we won't be visible from the ground, Marco said. Especially since the barn is half covered in grapevines. Sarah felt as though she had found herself in a place where one should make a wish, a sea of greenery all around, an orange sunset sky above, and her beloved beside her. If she thought about it, was there anything left she could wish for? It seemed there was. You know, I agree with Tonio, she said to her husband. Our house does feel a bit empty. You want a shepherd dog too? Marco asked in surprise. Who will take care of it? You wanted to go back to work. You said Maria would soon start preschool. I did say that, but I've decided to extend my leave. Sarah looked at her husband with a glowing gaze and whispered, We're going to have a baby. You're happy, aren't you? Marco stared at his wife for a few moments, taken aback by the unexpected news, then embraced her tightly and kissed her. And that said more to Sarah than any words could.
If you're enjoying it as well, leave a like and subscribe to the channel.